In 1848, the same year that Marx and Engels produced the Communist Manifesto, Elizabeth Gaskell published Mary Barton. Gaskell, like Engels, had studied the plight of the working classes in Manchester. She recorded, "I had always felt a deep sympathy with the careworn men who looked as if doomed to struggle through their lives in strange alternations between work and want." You may find it as puzzling as I do that academics at Warwick University have declared that the book is potentially upsetting for students. Their trigger warning alerts them to the novel's extreme classism. Warwick joins a long list of higher educational centres that have removed or made optional core texts, including Beowulf, the works of Thomas Hardy, Enlightenment philosophy, and some of Shakespeare's plays. Warwick says that individual departments and academics decide what warnings to give, and points out that less than 1% of the university's overall curriculum includes any content guidance. Joining me shortly in the studio will be Dr. Arif Ahmed, a philosophy professor who has railed against censorship of literature, and English literature student Charlie Bentley-Astor. Charlie, great to see you. I don't know whether you are familiar with Mary Barton, but what's your reaction to this particular story?
That it's not an uncommon one, for one. At my own university, there are trigger warnings on all our lectures. And I know certainly some academics who give out reading lists to their supervisees will put trigger warnings next to certain texts. I frankly find it quite infantilizing and demeaning. And any trigger warning robs the text of its potential to shock, because you're sort of pre-warned, oh, by the way, this death might be quite violent. And if you're aware that one, a character is going to die, and two, it's going to be a grisly one, you're kind of going into it with, you've steeled yourself against its potential effects that it might have on you, and robs the writer of what they intended for the text as well.
As I said a moment ago, Warwick claims that there are only warnings on 1% of texts. Which is your own institution?
University of Cambridge.
University of Cambridge. Have you any idea on what percentage of text you might see a trigger warning? What does it feel like?
I'd say 20%.
20%, that's quite a high number.
Certainly most lectures have some sort of trigger warning next to them.
Most lectures?
Most lectures will have some sort of, whether it be colonialism or sexism or classism or any, even things just like blood. We will discuss blood in this lecture, you know. So it depends what kind of supervisor you get. Some supervisors are quite rigorous with providing trigger warnings, and others don't tend to bother. So for some academics, it will be definitely more like 20%. For some, it might be in that 1%.
So we're only talking to you. Are you able, quite dispassionately, to say what you think the bulk of your colleagues think of this? Do you know where opinion lies? What do they think about trigger warnings? Do they also find it, I think your word was, infantilizing?
Yeah. No, I'd say most of the students haven't given it a second thought, if I'm honest. And when I first got to university, I noticed trigger warnings next to my lectures and some of the books I was being recommended to read, and just sort of shrugged it off. Because I was like, oh, okay, this is how it works here. This is what we do. But certainly, other students just tend to, if you do bring it up, just tend to shrug it off, thinking, oh well, it's inclusive to have the trigger warnings on there.
That's interesting, because it's a debate that rages in certain newspapers and periodicals, and indeed in Parliament. But you say the people at whom it is directed scarcely debated at all. Yeah,
it's a non-topic in a way.
Is it a non-topic because it's almost the same thing, but that it's a non-issue? So, I mean, who cares if these things appear? I mean, should we get used to it in the way that we get used to the certification of films, which we've always had and we will take for granted? So is it just something that is there, but we're entitled to ignore it?
I think that's the way I've had to navigate doing the literature degree that I do, that I just see there's a little sort of triangle with an exclamation mark, and that's how they notify us in our course. And I just as soon as I see it, just glance over it. I don't want to know what the trigger warning is, because like I said, it prepares me for something I don't want to be prepared for. I want to be shocked and challenged and all of these things.
Do you make any exceptions? I mean, for example, the most obvious thing would be sexual violence. Do you think that students really ought to be warned about sexual violence in a text?
It is difficult because it comes down to a person-by-person basis. And personally, for me, I've considered this matter as someone who's had PTSD in the past. I thought that maybe that's what I would want at the time, but having lived through that, I've realised that personally for me, I don't. But it doesn't mean that perhaps something like that. But it's where you draw the line with when students say harm and how subjective that can be. It's where do you draw the line?
So can you imagine any place whatsoever for censorship? Are there any things that students should not be seeing on the recommendation of their teaching staff?
No. I think for me, any kind of censorship encroaches upon personal autonomy. And often in the freedom of speech debate, we talk about the freedom to speak, but not the freedom to listen and the freedom to engage. And the big argument against free speech is that language shapes people and images and all of art shapes people. And so in someone saying to you, you can't see this thing, you shouldn't want to see this thing, you can't read it, you're taking away that person's ability to shape their own life in some real sense.
That would be very much the way that I would see it. And just as a reminder, I assume all students are adult in the sense that they're over 18.
Over 18, yeah.
Yeah. Arif, Ahmed is here. Hello.
Hi, good to meet you.
We were talking initially about the trigger warning on Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton, which is thought to be to show classism. I mean, actually, it's about poverty in Manchester in the middle of the 19th century. What's your reaction to this news? This is at Warwick University.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to say about that. So the first thing is, I think it's important to distinguish between cases where an institution actually forces trigger warnings on individual academics and cases where individual academics make a decision for themselves to put trigger warnings or content warnings, whatever you want to call them. And in some ways, I think the second kind of case is a bit more benign because it's an individual academic making a decision about a text that they think, make certain points which they think people ought to be warned about, and that's why they do it. So there's something, I think less harmful about that. Having said that, one wonders what the useful point of it is, because when you think about what's the actual empirical evidence that trigger warnings do any good, it's not clear there is any. So you might wonder whether in some cases, I wouldn't want to talk about these individual lecturers, but you might wonder whether in some cases putting trigger warnings on something is really just a form of virtue signaling or an opportunity for virtue signaling rather than meeting, for instance, the demands of the Equality Act or meeting some other requirement of the university.
Does it matter in the end? I mean, the Daily Mail and GP News get very excited about these things, but does it matter in the end? There are lots of trigger warnings. Students probably ignore them. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it can matter. So one reason why it can matter is from my own experience at my university, sometimes which is Cambridge University, so sometimes universities can encourage, and you wonder whether it will eventually be compulsion, staff to put trigger warnings or content notes, as they're now called, onto works which don't just signal specific things that might trigger memories of traumatic episodes, but something much more broad and general. So if you're being asked, for instance, to put a trigger warning on something if it contains transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, disparagement of religion, the first thing is you as an individual lecturer are being forced to make a political judgment about the work that you're setting. Those judgments will disagree, and you're going to be in trouble if you make the wrong judgment. So that, I think, is quasi-tyrannical, and I think that's probably the most worrying thing about it. The other somewhat worrying thing about it is the burden that's imposed on individual lecturers. If you're required to look through every single text that's being read and find a single page or sentence that somebody might think is Islamophobic or Christianphobic or anti-Semitic or transphobic, it's going to involve a huge amount of work, and the risks of getting it wrong might be quite high if there's an expectation among students that that's going to happen. So
the danger, apart from infantilizing students, which is the point we've been hearing about just a moment ago, is also a political one, and it's a creeping political one. It's getting worse, is it?
I believe it is, yes. So one of the indices of this is the fact that sometimes universities will present these requirements as though there's something that come from legislation. for instance, the Equality Act, and they'll say the Equality Act requires you to make reasonable adjustments, and this is what content warnings are. But then there's a huge expansion of what they count as content warnings, going well beyond what the legislation requires, which involves ultimately universities and perhaps university administrators impinging on what ought to be the academic judgment of individual lecturers. That's what's dangerous, I think.
Actually, you make a really good point, and legislators need to think about this a lot more. It isn't just what legislation says, it's what people do with that legislation. And I know that in one field after another, people who have agendas will make assertions about what a law says, and those assertions are not justified, and no lawyer would back them up on that. I found that a very interesting discussion. Thanks to Charlie Bentley-Astor and Dr. Arif Ahmed.